Back and hey, want to make some announcements just for 1 second. Tomorrow at 1:30 Pacific, I'll have Derek Johnson to come on. He was going to talk about his role as ambassador of Oakland Restaurant Week and his future as a political candidate in Oakland. He's definitely going to break some news. He may be switching over to District 2 from running for mayor, but maybe not. And then, of course, we have the person you've been waiting for, my friend Mike Jacob.
Who's
late.
Yeah. I had a high school teacher whose favorite phrase was better never than late.
Exactly. Or better never on time than I haven't quite figured that one out yet. But hey, Mike, as I said off camera, I want to make this sort of a teaching because there are a lot of people who don't understand what CEQA is, the California Environmental Quality Act. There are people who are under the impression that this can be countersued. And as one who knows enough CEQA to be relatively conversant, but not necessarily dangerous, because I skipped my CEQA classes at Cal, because I thought urban planning was a lot more what I wanted to do, urban economics. And I probably should have, went the other way, but I didn't. I played cleanup for years. So first of all, tell people what CEQA is.
Yeah, and we can do the 30,000 foot.
Yeah, that would be great.
Pretty quick, and then we can get into some of the specifics on this project. And then it's probably a good idea anyways, because there's also the streamlining for this project, and we can talk a little bit about that too. But just in general, and I don't know if you can hear this.
One thing I want to.
Yeah.
This is Mike Jacob is the attorney for Pacific Maritime Association. He is the lead on the CEQA lawsuit. So I want to make sure that I appropriately introduced him, even though by now a lot of you probably should know who he is. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. The California Environmental Quality Act, it's been around for about 50 years now. And it tracks about the same vintage as the National Environmental Protection Act. And they're both meant essentially to inform policymakers about potential impacts from projects and force those policymakers, whether they're elected officials, in this case, the city council, or in other instances when you have a project that is actually being done by a public agency, that they actually evaluate and analyze and then have a methodology for mitigation of impacts from their projects. And they make informed decisions, and then the public has a way to actually go through a process, which is supposed to be relatively iterative, about identifying those, commenting on those impacts, analyses, and mitigation measures, and then having a feedback loop for how then that project might go forward. And essentially, it's intended to be a process that I think everyone agrees is pretty rudimentary with respect to policymaking at its core. Do you want to be making decisions that are well informed? Of course you do. Do you want to make decisions that make the project incorporate or mitigate as many of those facts as possible in a way which is least impactful? Of course you do. And then when you make decisions that go beyond that, you want to identify what the scope and scale of those decisions are. And you want policymakers to know and have knowingly made decisions, even if they're counter to what some people might consider good as a judgment, but they can't be accused of being ill-informed, right? And that's kind of the baseline. Over the last 50 years, it's totally blossomed into a whole lot of things that people can be rightfully critical of. I spent a lot of my career being pretty critical of CEQA myself on behalf of our members because it's very exacting. It has been criticized for being way too tedious, and for a lot of other instances in a lot of projects, it's also viewed as a paper exercise. and a paper tiger, which actually benefits attorneys and engineers and biologists and consultants a lot more than it does the environment. But suffice to say, the way you go through that process is a public agency. In this instance, they receive a project from a developer. It's a proposal for them to take an action. And every single time a public agency takes an action in California, you have to evaluate whether or not it's subject to CEQA. So some things aren't. Some things are just exempt. They don't rise to the degree of a project. Some things just patently are. And then once you're subject to CEQA, then there's another set of evaluations you have to make. Is your project substantial enough that it actually needs to have a full environmental impact report? So smaller projects have just not reached that threshold. So they might not be significant enough or large enough that they trigger having to have a full environmental impact report or an EIR. Under federal law, the corollary is an EIS, an environmental impact statement. The EIR is really substantial, though. That means you're having to take a lot of time, energy, money, and attention from a public agency before you move forward with that next step. Obviously, for Howard Terminal, it's a mega project. There's no way you are going to avoid an environmental impact report under CEQA. And everyone knew that well in advance. The city knew that, the A's knew that. And when they put out their first document to start that process, which is a notice of preparation, it just flat out said, this is a huge project. We're going to need a full EIR, which means they didn't even do that initial checklist that you go through. So normally what happens is if a developer comes with a project, or if it's a self-initiated project for a public agency, they have an initial checklist they go through. And they go through it and they say, will this project have a lot of impacts? Yes or no? There are a bunch of guidelines that qualify that process. In this case, the city and the A's basically just knew, this is a huge project. We're going to need an EIR. They basically skipped that phase and went straight into an EIR preparation mode. And that was at the same time, back in 2018, that they finished going to the legislature and asking for CEQA streamlining. So they didn't ask for an exemption. They didn't ask for the Environmental Quality Act to not apply to their project. They asked for a streamlining process to make it apply, but apply faster and with some relatively privileged and rare status with respect to the speed at which both the documents had to be prepared by the city in anticipation of a lawsuit, and then how fast the courts have to process that litigation. And the general overall process that you would typically go through is because lo and behold, this might be surprising to some people who might think otherwise, but not every project, gets litigated under CEQA. And there's a lot of confusion out there about, people think all these projects take forever and they're really expensive because of the lawsuits. It's typically the other way around. They take a really long time to do, and they're really expensive because everyone's trying to make sure they don't get sued. And so it creates a whole lot of delay and cost on the front end of a project. If you're a fan of CEQA, you're going to say it's working. If you're not a fan of CEQA, you're going to say it's a big detriment. The truth, obviously, is somewhere in the middle.
There are people who say both, alternately. They either love it when it works for them or hate it when it works against them, right?
Absolutely. And but as a tool, the entire point of it is to inform decision makers. And so CEQA and EIRs do not require policymakers or politicians to make good decisions. You can make a really dumb decision, but it requires you to make an informed decision. And as part of all of that, process, really the key is to make sure that you've produced an adequate EIR, which has gone through all of the potential options for hitting marks on a number of different chapters. So, for example, standard EIR chapters include things like biological resources. Are you impacting a endangered species, or air quality? What is the project going to do with respect to emissions? Or water quality, what does it look like with respect to that? Hydrology, underground water, liquefaction, hazardous materials is another one. Traffic circulation is a chapter in your EIR. Noise is a chapter in your EIR. Light, and then there's a lot of other factors in there too. But you can imagine how many different, over 50 years of people doing these reports, how many different ways you could branch out at the potential environmental impacts. Safety is one of them. There are other portions of the EIR too that are also really important. One of the things that a report has to do is list alternatives to your project and then compare those alternatives with your proposed project. And one of those alternatives always has to be no project, a no project alternative. So you tell policymakers, you don't have to approve this. You also don't have to approve it the way the developer wants you to. You could consider another path forward. And those other paths might actually produce environmentally superior outcomes. And so when you're looking at all of these projects, one of the things that's really standard is, how do you ask for practitioners, it's standard to ask that question, how do you evaluate the baseline? And the reason why you have to do that is not just to evaluate the deltas on the mitigations, to see what your mitigation measures are, which you do, but also because you have to establish what a no project alternative looks like. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's, the really broad look at it. Then typically, if there is a challenge to the adequacy of the EIR, that certification needs to happen within a set amount of time under the standard rules. Once it's filed, then the public agency, who didn't know they were going to be subject to litigation until they were sued, then has to prepare an entire file and a record of all of the data that they were using, and all the different hearings they held and all the correspondence they had and all that, and certify that record, publish it, and then you are off to court, and it takes a long time to go through all these things. What the A's did back in 2018 in anticipation of this was they established a specific streamlining statute that compresses all of those parts, including the composition of the record and the challenge in Superior Court and a potential appeal, if it goes to the Court of Appeals, to be completely done within 270 days. That clock starts after there's a certain amount of time after the lawsuits have been filed for the city to compile their record. But what the city's been doing this entire time, if you go on the Howard Terminal website, you can see they've been compiling the record from day one. So they don't have a lot to do. It's actually really smart. It's something, frankly, that most projects should be doing all the time anyways, because it provides a lot of transparency to the public.
And you're saying it's called AB 734 Bonta, right?
Yeah, that streamlining bill is 734. And it's it's patterned on other streamlining bills for big projects. There were some substantive issues in there and some procedural issues that they had to go through some hoops. We had some early litigation about whether or not that rule even applied to this project based on some timing considerations. Court found that it did. So that's the statute that the CIR is proceeding under. And so that leads up to where we are with this litigation. When you're bringing a challenge under CEQA of an EIR, you're challenging its adequacy. You're asking a judge to decide whether or not the lead agency, which is in this case the city, did an adequate job of analyzing all of those impacts, both identifying them and then analyzing them. And then once they've been properly analyzed, were they effectively mitigated and that you had the right alternatives. So there are lots of different ways that you could potentially not satisfy those certification criteria. If you didn't identify the right baseline, if you didn't analyze the deltas from those baselines, if you then didn't apply the right mitigations to those deltas from the baselines, and did you consider the application of those deltas and the mitigations from the baselines in alternatives. Those are all different evaluations that need to be done for these things. And then those have to be across all of those different subject areas. So, you can imagine pretty quickly how you got up to, the 4,000 pages and the thousands of pages of analysis in those appendices, and why it takes a long time to do these things. So, when we were filing our comments last year, that process essentially was already pretty quick by most CEQA standards for a project of this size. The city has done an amazingly quick turnaround, and I think that's going to be one of the themes, and we can talk about that a little bit more. Would you rather be fast or would you rather be good? And we know where the A's have stood on this project the whole time. This is all about speed for them.
Hey, I'm curious. The lawsuit is pretty clear on the intentions. It says, hey, look, and correct me if I miss it even just a little bit, but look, and I'm just breaking it down. The EIR did not address our concerns, and the city and the athletics did not pay attention to our comments and concerns. That's what it says, right?
Right. Yeah. In fact, there's a rule of construction in almost all of these challenges that says you have to have exhausted all of your administrative remedies before you go to court, which is to say you can't just show up in court if you didn't participate in the process first. And you can't just spring new stuff on the public agency in court that you didn't at least try to have a conversation with them about first when you had the opportunity, when they were spending all the time and energy on the report. So there's mutual obligations there between the public agency that's running the EIR, in this case the project developer, which is the A's, and the public, for you to step up when it's your turn to get up to the mic or to write a letter and say, here are the things that I'm really worried about that I don't think you addressed properly, or here are the things that we do think you addressed properly, but you didn't quite hit the mark on your response. So there's definitely a lot of places where we just feel at the end of the day that the answers that we got to those issues we brought up were just not adequate.
And I want to get something out of the way that was written on ASPAN Network, and it's this idea that this could be countersued because of the nature of this. This isn't a countersuit situation. You want to talk about that? So
yeah, sure. Yeah, I saw that too. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, this is not civil litigation in the classic sense where there's two parties that are fighting over something. This is an administrative writ, which means it's a challenge to the government, and you're asking the government to actually fulfill their legal obligations and their duties. So if a government agency doesn't perform the way they're supposed to, you can take them to court. If a government agency fails to do something that they're obligated to do, you can bring a writ, you can take them to court. This is no different than that. So the A's are a named party because they're a party in interest because it's their project. But the failure is one of a public agency. And the question before a judge is, did this city do what they needed to do to fulfill all of their obligations. And anyone can bring that suit. The standing bar, which is, the way that you talk about, whether or not you have a legitimate ability to show up in court and assert your position, that's standing, is pretty low. Because there's two ways to get into a CEQA case in court. You're either an interested party who's commented because it impacts you in some way, shape, or form, you're a stakeholder. That's one way to do it. Or you're asserting a public interest. Well, that's pretty much everything. Everything in the world is either a private interest or a public interest.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to state which one you are, but once you're there, you're there. But there's no such thing as a countersuit. Anyone in the public is actually more or less encouraged to participate in this process, right? I mean, there's a cattle call for projects. Anyone in the world can bring a comment on an environmental impact report, and it's encouraged to do so. That's the entire point of the requirement that you exhaust your administrative remedies. No surprises, but everyone hears everyone's input, and then you address it. And so everyone who's participated in this process had a right to be there. There were over 400 comments. Obviously, there were a lot by fans in support of the project, and there were a lot of people who are detractors of the project. Any one of those people had the right to be there. And a countersuit would essentially imply that somehow you didn't have the right to raise a comment. And frankly, that's just either completely missing the point, or it's
kind of
just mean-spirited. Yeah.
It's also stupid because basically telling it's like just this side. It's how do I put it? It's a slap lawsuit gone wrong. Right?
That's exactly what it is. So, a SLAP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, which is something that someone does to keep you from being able to assert your legal rights in court. And there are, as you probably know, there are a lot of cases of successful anti-SLAP motions by people who are basically saying, I have a right to be here.
Yep.
You can't take that away. Anti-SLAP is really important because it preserves people's access to court, and that means that it preserves their rights. So yeah, I mean, you can't be sued. There's no such thing as a countersuit in a CEQA case, because the entire concept of it is to encourage the public to interact with the government so the government is informed. And so our petition basically says we don't believe that the city properly certified the EIR, which means they haven't properly analyzed, they haven't properly established that baseline, their mitigation measures aren't appropriate, and they didn't include the right alternatives. That's it. And you can be right or wrong, but you have the right to assert it as long as you participated in that process and you felt like your input was not well received.
Let me ask a question. I want to work backward. How could the Athletics have avoided the situation that exists right now?
Well,
and the city of
yeah. I mean,
I didn't mean to put it all on the A's.
Yeah.
It's the A's and the city.
And the city.
The
short answer is the best way to avoid this is to be exceptionally thorough, to disclose and analyze everything. And then when you receive comments, to address those comments and then recirculate your environmental impact report. That all takes a lot of time and money. And the entire theme of this project is we don't want to spend a lot of time and money on it. We just want to get an approval. We want shovels in the ground, and if we don't get them in the ground, we're going to put bids on 5 different properties in Las Vegas. Right? And but that's the way to do it. I mean, if you look at the biggest projects that move through, whether they have streamlining on a challenge or not, that's all back end, right? The best way to win in court is to never be in court. So the way you do that is pretty obvious, right? When you have a statute that has an exhaustion of administrative remedies like this does, it forces the people that are opposed to your project or have concerns with your project to come to the table and say what their issues are, which means you have that entire process set up for you. If your entire goal is to obviate those types of claims, that you would then take them, address them, fully analyze them, mitigate them to the extent you can. And guess what? Like I just said at the beginning, you don't have to make good decisions under CEQA. You just have to make informed decisions. So let's say they took every single thing that we said at face value, and they went back, they analyzed it, they came up with the impacts. They said, hey, you're right. There's some really big impacts here. And then they turned around and said, but we don't care. We're going to do this thing anyways. When you have significant impacts that aren't mitigated, the lead agency does what's called an adoption of a statement of overriding considerations, which this EIR has several, and we can talk about that. And then you move forward and you say, we're policymakers, we were well informed. We think this project is important enough that it needs to go forward without mitigating these things because of cost or feasibility or timing, or we just don't want to. I mean, there's lots of reasons why people make decisions, again, good or bad, smarter or dumb. And CEQA doesn't make that illegal. But it does make it hard. It makes it hard. I mean, it's not supposed to be easy to make a statement of overriding considerations. And a statement of overriding considerations occurs when the EIR process identifies there's a significant impact. And then it says, despite the fact there's a significant impact to, pick one, air quality, safety, water quality, we aren't going to mitigate that. We're going to let that impact remain outstanding, but we're going to go forward with the project anyways. So again, it's that process of forcing people to identify issues and deal with them publicly and transparently in an informed way. So that's the short answer is, when you have that process, everyone has to put their cards on the table. And when they put their cards on the table, the way you avoid the litigation is you go back and you fix it and you disclose it. The real reason why that didn't happen here was obviously time. And it exposes a lot of potential cost. So for example, one of the things that we have a real problem with is the fact that the existing uses of Howard Terminal weren't put into a baseline with respect to things like traffic circulation, air quality for trucks. So you've heard us talk about it a bunch of times, Dave and the A's boosters like to talk about Howard Terminal. It's a parking lot. It's a terminal. Functions a lot like a parking lot because that's how they work. But we have over 300,000 truck moves there a year in the baseline. So the environmental analysis of that should be, what happens when those trucks get displaced? Where do they go? What does that do for traffic? What does that do for air emissions? Those types of questions. And the EIR didn't acknowledge those things in a process where it could do that, because it said, we'll analyze them as part of this process, but we're not going to actually analyze it to a level of specificity because it's speculative. And everything at some level in an EIR is future looking, which means it requires a level of educated estimation that you would expect from any type of report. You have to hire specialists. You have to go through a process of getting a specialist to the table to do consulting for you. That's one of the reasons why these things take so long, and they're expensive. And it's a pretty high bar to just say, nah, it's speculative, I'm not going to do it. But in this case, they basically said, we don't want to analyze where those trucks go. They said, we can't guess where those trucks are going to go. There's hundreds of thousands of truck transactions, and those are done by thousands of trucks. Those trucks could go anywhere. So it's not worth our time and energy to analyze it.
I have to ask, when I was at Cal, we were just pioneering the model technology to evaluate buildings in wind tunnels and how they would create wind tunnels. And Peter was a pioneer. My professor's last name just went right out of my head. But at any rate, he was a pioneer at this and had an incredible class in models, and they've since advanced to computer technology. And I raised this question before. I think we were discussing it far back, but not long. But I did wonder, and I raised this question with Dave in a way. I said, do you have models of the project where you can drive around and, see how it's going to behave? And he said that they did, but really, for me, they didn't. In other words, this is 2022, right? This is April 4th, if I'm not mistaken. And yet, as far into the turn of the century, as far as we are into the 21st century, and with all that has transpired in terms of the technology to evaluate a project even of this size, why isn't it, and I know you probably don't have this correct answer, but I can't seem to get an answer from anybody from the city. The city won't talk to me for the most part, and for reasons that I grade as basically Dave Cavall talks to me most of the time. I haven't been able to get a hold of him this time. But doesn't it seem rather surprising that there isn't an evaluative mechanism that they could drive Howard Terminal through, see where the trucks go, look at the impact? And when I think about that question I just asked you, I go right back to what is now called Allegiant Stadium and the night of the Nevada legislature vote, which was on the 14th of October of 2016 at about 11:30 at night. And all of a sudden, the drop equivalent of a 16-ton boulder boom hit on the legislature in the form of the Nevada Department of Transportation releasing this study that said it's going to cost you $900 million to mitigate traffic, and here is where the traffic is going to go if you build that stadium. Okay.
Right. Well, yeah, there are a lot of tools to do those types of things. So this EIR actually did. There's a couple intersections here. This EIR did include some levels of service calculations on establishing baselines around the stadium area, and levels of service are, how you determine the amount of congestion at an intersection. And there were some other studies that they did. We think they're pretty inadequate and wimpy, but be that as it may, of other places where traffic might go in the city. They're also required to do vehicle miles traveled evaluation, which is called VMT. And that's primarily to examine total amount of additional driving and GHGs and greenhouse gases that are being developed by your project. How many people are driving versus taking transit or walking or what have you. And so there were a number of those. I mean, I don't think that there was a single area where the city didn't say, we're not going to produce some additional analysis of this project. Like I said, from the very start, they knew that they had to do a full-blown EIR. So there's nothing in our petition that says, boy, they just totally missed a topic area, right? It's but it's in that question that's kind of the core of a lot of our complaint, which is you acknowledge that the issue is there, but instead of actually developing an analysis to measure the delta, you just said it was speculative.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have the delta, you can't determine if that impact is significant. And the legal significance of that is if you're in your report and you don't find there's significant impact, you don't have an obligation to look at mitigation measures. So we know, I mean, it's part of the project. It's by design. We know you're going to displace trucks. Where are they going to go? The report doesn't tell you. If the report doesn't tell you, then you don't know what the impacts are. If you don't know what the impacts are, can't mitigate it.
I just want to say that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that what was done at Berkeley was the idea, and is the idea that you can drive a project through an environment, right? So in a perfect world, right?
You can. Yeah.
Right. So in a perfect world, you can say, all right, boom, let's turn on the switch and see where the trucks go. But what happens if we put a truck stop over here?
That is exactly right.
And then you see where you can draw. That's what I'm saying. You're evaluating the project. Right. You're driving the project through the environment. You're seeing how the environment adjusts, and you're actually actively putting something else in to make the environment behave in a different, more desirable way. This can do that.
Those models exist. Those models are available. You have to hire consultants to do it. And it is not unreasonable. It is certainly within the scope of the realm of what these folks should be doing. And that's our argument. There's a lot of, you'll see it in our petition. There's a lot of times that we use the phrase deferred analysis or deferred mitigation. Your EIR cannot come back and say, we know this is a problem, and our solution to that is more studies. Or our solution to that is someone else is going to do a study. Or our solution to that is we're going to study that in the future once we know more about the project. All three of those things violate one or the other parts of CEQA. One of them is your project has to have a steady project definition. And that means you have to adequately define it up front. And if you can't, if there's moving parts to it, or there's a lot of variations on it where you can't really get a handle on it, then the decision makers aren't really informed. What's the project? Well, that's a problem. If you come back later and you say, well, I'm going to have a mitigation measure, but I don't know exactly how it's going to work yet, so I'm just going to let that happen in the future, then you've got a problem too, because you don't know if it's actually going to be mitigated. If you didn't adopt a statement of overriding considerations, then you've just done it wrong. So deferred mitigation is a real problem. You might have seen in some of the comments, that came back from public agencies were about, they couldn't tell whether or not this was a program level EIR or a project level EIR. And those are two different ways you can do environmental impact reporting. And probably the easiest way to talk about that as an example is one of them's more generalized and one of them's more specific. So when you have a big overarching project, like you're adopting a general plan, right, for a city, where you're changing zoning and you're changing the total plan, and you're doing big broad policy stuff. You need to do an EIR because that's a project. But you're allowed to have your environmental impact report talk about things in a broader context, because those are big and broad theories that you're putting into that general plan. But when you're doing a specific project or a zoning change under that general plan, it's got to be specific. You're talking about one parcel, one specific planned development, just like Howard Terminal is. It's multiple parcels, but it's one project. So you need to be specific. And one of the things that several of the comments were about, it was hard to tell whether or not this was a project level or a program level EIR, because there was a lot of it, as we point out in our comments, that look like deferred mitigation. They look like they're general in nature. They're not specific. This was always intended to be a project level EIR. It's not intended to be a program level EIR. The biggest difference there is if this was a program level EIR, then every time you went through any of the actual implementation measures, like building a stadium, the stadium would need a new EIR just for that project. Right. Build a residential tower, you need a new EIR for that project. Build the hotel, you need a new EIR. That is not what the A's are asking for.
Yeah. But something to your comment though, it would have been intellectually gauche to do that because you have these buildings so close together that they try to be evaluated as a project EIR, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, think about it also from just a effectiveness of your mitigation strategy from the city's perspective with their development agreement. You don't want this to be 15 different projects because there's 16 different parcels where there's one stadium and there's 10 different developers. And you don't want that. You want someone to be responsible, and that's the master developer, and that's the A's, for everything. You want them to be able to, and we can segue this into your favorite topic too, on the infrastructure financing. You want one point of responsibility to say, this is how I'm going to deal with the congestion from 35,000 people leaving a stadium all at once next to a brand new community of 3,500 people living there and a 1.5 million square foot office complex, right? You don't want to have the stadium people pointing at the housing people pointing at the stadium, and both of them pointing at the office complex. It's their responsibility, their fault. You don't want that. You need to make sure, again, you have a stable project description, so you know what it is. And we can talk about this in a sec too. When there are also variables in there, you can have variables, but they need to be distinct and they need to be separately analyzed. It's like the gondola was in the CIR as a variant. The turning basin, in a sense, is in there. It's not a variant. It's identified as an alternative project description. And then the other place you test those things is in the alternative section. And so if you're not in one of those three areas where you have a different project description, you have a project variant, or you're in the alternative, you're not getting analyzed. And so that's, again, back to a lot of our concern about, is this compatible or not? Not showing up in the project description. Well, that's a bummer. I wrote a letter to them in summer of 2019 saying, hey, I know I said this in your initial notice of preparation before the port even adopted its non-binding term sheet in spring of 2019, but you haven't, adequately analyzed our impacts. Then when the port actually did their non-binding term sheet, they added seaport compatibility measures. So we wrote a letter to the city and we said, hey, this is part of the project description now. You should include it in the description of your project for your EIR. Nope. So, maybe back to some of your original question, how would you avoid a lot of this? Well, put it in the project description. Doesn't mean you have to build it. And that's the other thing about an EIR. It's like a lot of other entitlements. You have to plan for the greatest project possible and view everything. That doesn't mean you have to build it. Doesn't mean you have to entitle it. Doesn't mean you have to actually do everything that you plan for. But you need to analyze it. So that's part of the challenge here too. So did they analyze where those trucks were going to go? No. When you look at the suit that was filed by UP, and I haven't read it yet, but I can guarantee you, it's going to tell you the story that the alternative that they asked for, which was a fully grade separated access into Howard Terminal, wasn't part of the analysis because they asked for that alternative and the city didn't analyze it. Again, the city didn't have to approve it. They still could have picked an outcome like they did that has a statement of overriding consideration. Sorry for the background dog noise, but you have a statement of overriding considerations because the mitigation measures they've chosen, even with the alternative that they picked for rail compatibility, doesn't eliminate safety issues. So they had the vote to adopt a statement of overriding considerations. It says this is patently unsafe. And UP said, we had an alternative that we proposed to you that you could have analyzed that would have eliminated that safety outcome. And you didn't analyze it. That's their that's going to be their claim in a nutshell. They might have other stuff in there too, but that's going to be the big one. And so that goes back to your question. How do you make sure you don't get sued? And it's to do an adequate EIR.
And it sounds to me again like there was not, well, I'll just rephrase it. There wasn't a computer-based model to drive the project through. And it looks to me like in our conversation, it seems to buttress the point I'm about to make again, that this is almost done in a piecemeal defensive fashion, all the way down to the way the comments are responded to, which was, I said, nasty and defensive. It wasn't as if they were, it was done, if they had a mechanism like what I'm talking with you about, they could say, okay, well, let's evaluate that idea, right? And they could drive it through and they could say, okay, we tried this and here's the outcome.
Right.
And they could spit it out in seconds, right? But there's none of that.
Right. There's a reason why in these processes you want a public agency to be in charge of the environmental review for a private party developer. It's because they're supposed to be dispassionate, third party, arm's length, objective evaluators. They're not supposed to be advocates. And one of the things that this process really smacks of is advocacy. We're going to accelerate it because that's what the project developer wants, right? Is not something that an independent, objective, analytical body does. They say, we're going to do this right.
I want to put back on you a little bit on that, because I think from my experience, okay, and particularly when I was in Oakland and was in the prehistoric non-computer times, we were building blocks and stuff like that. The public agency was the advocate, but it also ideally acted in a way where it said we're an advocate for the public, and we know we're building something that's going to impact the public.
Right.
So we're going to make sure we are adjusting it to hear the public, right? That's a different kind of advocacy than I think you're blasting.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. Well, just put it this way. So I was on the Alameda County Planning Commission for 12 years. I voted on a lot of environmental documents for projects. The bigger the project is, the more the staff has invested their time and energy into that project. So from a staff perspective, absolutely, I think you're right. I mean, there are a lot of people that are very well dedicated to making sure that these things happen. And I wouldn't want my comments to be construed as, saying that there was some reason why the I don't know, that's something.
I had,
yeah, that somehow the staff wasn't moving with their hearts in the right place. But what you want to make sure is that you've isolated those variables so the project developer isn't driving your schedule and that you're driving it as the public agency. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who's approving this thing. But there's no policy that's in place until the city council's acted. City council still hasn't approved a project here. So there's just not much that would, outside of political pressure, there's not much to identify why you would be moving forward on an EIR quicker than you needed to otherwise. If if you come to the conclusion that you have finished your analysis and you've put your pencils down, you're done. That's when it's supposed to go to the decision-making body. And the fact that they decided that, but they still had a lot of outstanding questions, I think just goes back to the point that they knew that they were going to get a challenge, and it was from people that didn't support the project. And they were more than happy to essentially just say, well, if they're going to sue us, let's just do the best project for us. And that's a project focus, and that's not a public focus.
These photographs are appropriate because these were taken right after the signing of AB 734, in happier days. So but also it's to buttress your point about sort of who was driving the train, at the time. I mean, the elected officials were there, but well, even then, it's just Rob, Libby, and Dave.
And there's absolutely no question that I think it's fair game for the A's to go to Sacramento and ask for what they asked for. And we were there too, and we were telling policymakers we were opposed to Rob's Bill 1191. We didn't take a position on 734. And part of that is, we didn't necessarily think that there was a whole lot to fight. The party that was most vociferously opposed to AB 734 was the Sierra Club.
Mm-hmm.
So we get back into some of these things really briefly, but I remember a couple, I guess it was right before the pandemic when Sierra Club came out and they said they had some concerns with the Howard Terminal project and they weren't all that happy with it. And, the response from the A's and the public was, how dare they, how awful, all this stuff. And
I remember, right.
I can't believe it. They were opposed to your very first bill. Like from the very first time you talked about this stuff.
Yeah.
Sierra Club was there with concerns.
Dave went to bat against them. I never really agreed with the Sierra Club's point of view, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm interested in is this is in the current petition, and it says the governor failed to certify the Howard Terminal project by December 31st, 2019. Does that dovetail with your last legal challenge before this one?
Yeah, this one is we obviously we have a history here, and so the prior litigation was on this question as to whether or not, and I think this is from that one. I think this is from our previous petition.
It's page 835 of the petition.
Yeah. So this was our previous one.
Mm-hmm.
So in AB 734, what they set up was this process of, apologize for the dog again too.
Is he mad at you about the lawsuit?
I don't think she follows Major League Baseball, but if she did, I think she would have wanted to stay as litigation free as possible.
Yeah. So she's mad at you. Even the dog's mad at you.
but for this project, AB 900 guidelines, AB 734, whatever you want to do, want to call it, the processes are there for large projects to essentially be able to make a set of findings that tell the world this is an environmental, it's called an environmental leadership project. We want to take advantage of these specific timelines. And so our contention in the previous litigation was they didn't make their timelines, didn't have to be met. And so there was no certification guideline or certification deadline. But to the earlier point, whether or not the review of the EIR is expedited under 734 or not doesn't change the underlying premise. And the underlying premise is you still have to do an adequate EIR.
What, how could the A's settle this? I'm asking that from a fan's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think to your earlier question, I think they've really kind of missed it, because all of the comments that we submitted and that I got from dozens of other people were asking for substantive changes to the EIR, because that's the way that you go through that process if you're willing to actually do anything that's a compromise. So let me take a step back. So when you're preparing an environmental impact document like an EIR and you put it out, if you make substantial changes to that document, you have to do what's called recirculation. You have to put it back out to the public. You need to say, either because you did it on your own or the project's changed or you're doing it and you're making those changes in response to comments. Whenever it happens, you basically are republishing it and you're telling everyone, hey, I made changes to this section of the document. We're recirculating it. So we'd like more comments on this. They chose to do no recirculations, which means out of thousands of pages and hundreds of comments, they were basically saying, we're making zero substantive changes to this document, which means they're making zero substantive changes to their project, which means they're interested in zero amounts of negotiation and settlement.
Yeah, and not only that, in his response to the media, Dave makes the comment that basically the lawsuit is fine, I mean, but rejects it because he says that the new ballpark will be better for the environment and people in the Bay Area. But in that statement alone, it tells me, and I'm saying this, not to be unfriendly to my friend, obviously, but just professionally, Dave is making the error of looking at this as a criticism regarding impact on the environment, which might maybe point to some um, inexperience regarding CEQA issues. I mean, I'm just saying that, okay? But
yeah, I think that's right. I think there's two things there. One of them is just to be really just somewhat analytical about it in the context of the EIR. It's impossible for him to say that because they have statements of overriding consideration, which means you have unmitigated impacts on the environment. I mean, he literally cannot claim, unless he, like you said, I mean, he's just making generic statements about his project, that his project is better for the environment if it's worse than the outcome of the no project alternative and you didn't actually mitigate your impacts. Now, there's lots of environmental impacts. And, again, back to, let's cut everyone some slack. There's all these different chapters. There's all kinds of different ways you can impact the environment. It's air quality, it's water quality, it's noise, it's transportation, it's all kinds of stuff. Cultural impacts is part of an EIR. So things that you might not consider environmental are. And they're part of this suite of things you need to analyze. But when you have significant overriding considerations for things like air quality, which this does, because it has significant impacts to air quality, they're not mitigated. So air quality after this project goes through will be worse. You can say, how is that possible? Because Dave keeps talking about how this is going to be great for greenhouse gases. It's greenhouse gas neutral after they potentially buy a bunch of credits for greenhouse gases. But that's not the only air quality impact. You have to look at NOx emissions and particulate matter emissions and other criteria pollutants And what happens with all of those when you have all of, not just the operation of the stadium, but the construction of the stadium and all the construction traffic, and what happens with all those trucks that are bringing all this stuff in and out and everything. That's really significant. But for this project, it's the same kind of analysis you would do on the financial side you're doing on the environmental side.
Yep.
For this project, would you have tens of thousands of trucks running through downtown and West Oakland going to this site? No. Did you mitigate those impacts? No. We looked at it, and the numbers show that the actual increase compared to 300,000 truck moves, if you can believe this, compared to 300,000 truck moves at that site, this project will actually increase particulate matter emissions by 40%. It's dirtier. And then you go to this other question, which I love, because I think it's just hilarious, that Dave's comment back to people was, well, the people that are complaining about this pollute. They're polluters. It's absurd that you could use CEQA to, like, the biggest irony, because one of our biggest complaints is that the process for this EIR and with the port in general does not adequately protect us from other people suing us, because they're going to be putting people, 3,500 people living, and then 35,000 people at the stadium, and then 1.5 million square feet worth of workers right next to and downwind of what we do, which is turn huge container ships, do all of our unloading, have hundreds of thousands of truck moves, and plus then there's Schnitzer too. Nothing about this project even comes close to dealing with those issues. We're not part of the definition of the project, which is one of the reasons why we asked for seaport compatibility measures to be included in the project definition. They have not been, which gets back to this whole thing. How does Dave think his project, I'm sorry, to be so frank about it, but how does his project is going to clean up anything? If they were going to do seaport compatibility, and he was going to allege that somehow that there were going to be fewer trucks, I don't know where, it's not in the project description. If you thought it was going to help clean up, our operations, I don't know how, not in the project description. I think there's a lot there. And then when you look at actually what they did and what they're proposing, they're not even mitigating all of their air quality impacts. So, and that's just looking at one of them, right? That's just air quality.
If I had to put a public PR lens on this, I think the language that Dave read was created by Catherine Aker, or someone else in public relations, because it sounds like something that A's marketing would write to gin up their fan base, as if this were a vote and not a detailed court lawsuit environment.
I think that's right. Right. I mean, I saw a quote from Dave again this afternoon in the article that the Chronicle put out about the UP lawsuit being filed. And off the top of my head, I can't quote it, but he essentially said he thinks it's absurd and crazy that he got sued by UP. And I mean, there's no way he can think that, because he knows he was going to, because they ignored all of their comments, and they've been working and hearing from them for the last 4 years on this project. But it's endemic in the project. Like from the very start, everyone knew one of the things you'd have to mitigate is the interaction with the train. That's why, MLB for years and years and years, and Lou Wolf said, we're not even going to look at the site. Like, how do we get 30,000 people or more with a bigger stadium across those train tracks safely? So there's no way you can be surprised by that. But I'm just kind of struck by the fact that you have a Fortune 100 company that's been in business for 170 years. And its two primary purposes are maintain its right of way and rail safety.
Mm-hmm.
And he's surprised that they sued when you didn't address how you're going to maintain their right of way and rail safety. I mean, this is not out of the blue. It's not even close. So, you know, it's, I think, you know, just the crass way to say it is, it just comes down to money. They don't want to actually analyze these impacts. They don't want to analyze the alternatives, because someone at the city might get the bright idea of saying, hey, if I had to choose between voting for a statement of overriding consideration that says we're going to kill people, because that's what that statement of overriding consideration says about rail safety, and asking the A's to spend an extra, you know, couple $100 million in 2 years engineering an actual adequate access route for this place that's going to be in place, by the way, for 66 years. That's the stadium lease.
Yep.
Which is not unreasonable. That's a real issue. That's a policy issue. And again, that goes back to the point of CEQA and the EIR. You're supposed to be presenting options to policymakers. When you don't analyze the options, that's when you failed. And this failed to do that.
You included a letter here I'd like to ask you about. It was from Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf to Richard Corey of the California Air Resources Board, dated February 28, 2020. It's in the appendix. And she writes, I write concerning the potential future of the Oakland Coliseum site, which includes the stadium and associated parking lots of the Coliseum. Today, the Coliseum is the home field of the Oakland Athletics and the Oakland Raiders. The Raiders franchise is moving to Las Vegas next season, leaving the A's as the only remaining tenant. As you know, the Coliseum was built in the early 1960s, with its first game held in 1966. As indicated in prior correspondence to you from us, the City of Oakland prepared a specific plan for the Coliseum City area in which it noted the Coliseum was, quote, obsolete, unquote, and would be demolished in the circumstance where neither the A's nor the Raiders were anchor tenants. Once the Coliseum loses its anchor tenants, there may not be a steady revenue stream to support the ongoing maintenance and repair of this facility. We understand that in association with the Howard Terminal project, in the event the Coliseum is not demolished immediately following the A's departure, the California Air Resources Board wishes to have a commitment regarding the potential use of the newly available dates in excess of the historic average of 4 non-sporting events per year at the Coliseum. By this letter, I confirm that the A's have agreed, and the city will enforce the following. If 1, the project is approved and constructed, 2, the A's leave the Coliseum, and 3, the Coliseum is not demolished, then for each year the Coliseum is not demolished and events exceed 4 per year, the A's are required to fully reduce and offset, consistent with AB 734 requirements, Rob Bonta, all greenhouse gas emissions associated with events that are in excess of 4 per year. I understand that the application provided by the A's to California Air Resources Board must identify a menu of reduction measures and their associated greenhouse gas reductions that the A's may then select to reduce emission from these excess events in accordance with a process and methodology included in the application and approved by the California Air Resources Board. As you know, the city, as the lead agency charged with enforcing the obligations of the A's under AB 734, has agreed to monitor and enforce obligations if the project is certified by the governor, approved, and constructed. Please note that the city has no obligation to approve, and the A's have no obligation to develop the project unless and until the parties have negotiated, executed, and delivered mutually agreeable, accepted agreements based upon information provided from the CEQA and environmental review process that we're talking about, you and I, and other public review and hearing processes subject to all applicable regulatory approvals. The city retains the absolute sole discretion to, 1, modify the project as the city in its sole discretion deems necessary to comply with CEQA. 2, select other feasible alternatives and or impose mitigation measures to avoid or reduce significant environmental impacts. 3, balance the benefits of the project against any significant environmental impacts prior to taking final actions if such significant impacts cannot otherwise be avoided, and or 4, determine not to grant the requisite approvals for the project. Thank you for your consideration of this letter. Please do not hesitate to call if you have any questions. Sincerely, Mayor Libby Schaaf, with a copy to Jared Blumfeld, Secretary for Environmental Protections, Councilmember Lauren Taylor, City of Oakland, Alameda County Supervisor Nate Miley, and Alameda County Supervisor Scott Haggerty, who is no longer with us in that role. And I present that because, first of all, why is it in this Exhibit A? And then B, it sounds like almost the 180-degree polar opposite of what Dave is saying now, that, hey, this is it. We're not going to change. Boom, that's it.
Yeah. A lot of moving parts. And, obviously that was a couple of years ago. It was well written with respect to all of those caveats. I think that's right. The main reason why that letter was even necessary to be sent to the Air Resources Board was because they started asking questions about that initial certification, and the A's thought they didn't have to actually do what they asked the legislature to do, which was prove that they were going to have a level of confidence in whatever EIR process that was ultimately going to go down, which is what happened ultimately with respect to GHGs. So the way that the greenhouse gas emissions mitigation is supposed to work is that they're supposed to be guaranteeing that they'll at least have no net GHGs.
Greenhouse gases, folks.
Right, that's right. And so the process of doing that was a little interesting because they took as a baseline, and it's different. It's not an EI. It wasn't an EIR comparison, and that's one of the reasons why we have a problem with this. In that, we mentioned in our complaint too. They're using a baseline of operations at the Coliseum, and they're comparing it for operations at Howard Terminal, right?
Yeah.
Which isn't entirely inappropriate, but it's not the whole story. There's 2 sites. So you have to take the baseline off of both sites and the new operations at both sites to really identify what the total environmental impact of this project is. The A's wanted to pick and choose and say, here's what we did at the Coliseum. Here's what we're going to do at Howard Terminal. That's our analysis. And we've said no. Again, you need to analyze our current operations. What happens to those? They're impacted. Same thing's true at the Coliseum. Is nothing going to happen with that 150 acres? No way. And so.
And you put that up.
One off the other.
I need to add. I apologize for something I didn't intend to do, is to run over your comment. Did I interrupt something you were trying to say?
No.
Okay. I think it's important to note that, and this is my contention, that the reason why that, first of all, we had a dual ENA situation for those people who are wondering how we got here to begin with. The idea initially was that the A's are going to develop at the Coliseum. The Raiders were gone, but I believe I'm not sure if it was Libby that buttonholed Fisher or one other way around, but between them, Howard Terminal came up as the alternative. And rather than Libby just giving an ENA for Howard Terminal, what she did was she gave them a choice. She said either choose the Coliseum or Howard Terminal. What they did was they chose both. They quite literally split the difference and took advantage of a situation And rather than Libby saying, no, 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 I didn't ask you to do that, she let him do it. That's really how we got here.
Well, that's after Laney and all that stuff too. I mean, I think, that raises another, and maybe we can kind of wrap up.
I want to emphasize one point before we.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. The Athletics didn't want the Coliseum to exist because they don't want the NFL back in Oakland, because they wanted to crowd out the NFL and leave it for just the Niners, so that any future business operations they would have will not be threatened by professional football in its backyard. That's why.
I believe you.
Everything that they've done, this isn't something they're going to say, but every action that the Athletics have taken has been, for example, look, let me put it this way. Let me be really simple. If the Athletics were interested in the NFL being here, they would have said, you know what, we'll help you get a team back in here. Have you ever heard the A's say that?
No. They can't even commit to keeping a baseball team here right now.
Seriously, this has been a sticking point for me as a person who loves the A's organization, knows a lot of people in it. You know a lot of people there too. But I've known them long enough, and I believe well enough to know that when they're going to do something, they either say they're going to do it and do it, or they do it but don't say they're doing it. That has been the A's MO for decades. Okay? And they're playing to the string. Same thing. They're going to take actions that are passive aggressive, which is a Bay Area thing anyway. Bay Area people love being passive aggressive. And they're going to say, hey, they're not going to address the question. They're just simply going to act it out. Look at how the African American sports entertainment group is being treated by the Athletics. By stalling them, even though the A's say we like them and we're meeting with them. But the question remains, why do they want to have some control down there? It's not because they want baseball down there. It's because they don't want football. That's why. That's why they agreed to tear the thing down to begin with. And they talked Libby into that, and Libby was just basically being their mouthpiece by that point.
Well, that might be true. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems here is that people at the city said yes too early, and weren't in a position to actually negotiate from a position of strength on a project that's this big. And maybe that part of that is the manifestation of the lack of early commitment to setting up the framework for actually making those first comments about what you need for your financing being so opaque. I mean, they still haven't, and this, set forward what they think their total sources and uses look like. I think that's part of our problem, right? I mean, we're not being asked to cut a deal with anyone. No one's trying to deal us in. No one's trying to get to yes. And I think that's not just with us. I mean, if you take, let's take one more step back on how we got here with the EIR stuff.
Before you go in that direction, I want to add one more something.
Yeah, go ahead.
You remember the town hall meeting that the city had just a few days before the vote at the NFL owners meeting that I was at in Arizona that days?
When was that?
Las Vegas. Remember that big town hall, East Side, about 500 people strong? Well, after that, and I have the video, I'm not going to go and pull it up, but it is on Zenny 62. Just type Dan Cow, Zenny 62. Dan specifically told me that the NFL better hurry up and make a decision, because if they're gone, we're not going to use that property for sports. So they had already set the table for the A's at Howard Terminal anyway, because they had this idea of capturing that area for its highest and best market value. The city has always been either, I say, plagued by political people who want to be more developers than developers. They think they can play basically monopoly with public money, and this is another example of that. Because if you're building something the highest and best use, it's market rate, and you're not necessarily going to get affordable housing unless you're willing to subsidize it. And that was not in the conversation at Coliseum. Now they're going to balk otherwise, but why would you say highest and best use unless you don't know what you're talking about? So
well, maybe I was going to say something totally different, which is, they didn't turn to Howard first; they turned to Laney. And this is part of going back to your question about, do they want to cut a deal? Why would they be surprised that they got the same amount of pushback from the Chinatown community on Howard that they got on Laney? Same kind of things that I think we're experiencing that they demonstrated they experienced with the Laney College folks. I mean, the number one constituency there that they needed to work with were the folks that are there already. That's the faculty and the students. Didn't do it. And where are the existing constituents at this location? Where are the deals ahead of time? Where's the reaching out, and where's the actual consensus building? Didn't happen.
What happened too is as I think about what you're saying and what we're talking about and how we got here, just to sort of put together, connect the dots, is the public is essentially saying to the city, we want you to keep sports at the Coliseum. We don't want you to push it someplace else because we need housing in these other areas. Coliseum has been slated for sports for decades. Why give it up? And yet you have the city council populated with some people, Dan Kalb among them, who says, well, we don't want sports there. That's 180 degrees opposite what the public wants, just by the way the public is acting. And that's what's really, hitting me hard in the head right here. They don't.
I think if there's a disconnect, what I think the public, what we're hearing, and obviously we're biased towards the Coliseum, but the fans and city council members, they want certainty. They want to know that their team's going to be there, that they're going to invest in the community, and they're going to stick around. If the A's were really interested in having their new stadium open by 2023, they would have done it at the Coliseum. And that's not what they've been doing, and that's not where they're focusing. I mean, when it really comes down to it, they don't value the certainty of having a firm investment in some place they don't want to be. They have their eye on the prize, and that's the total real estate value of Howard versus East Oakland. And they've monetized 40 acres, if you take out the turning basin, to a degree where they think that they can make more money there than they can on 150 acres in East Oakland. Now, from a public perspective, someone needs to ask the question.
Build out.
Yeah, someone needs to ask the question. Does that include all the additional infrastructure financing? Does that include all of the cost of all these other public grants you're going to get? Have you taken into account the existing BART and freeway access and all that stuff, those types of investments? If you were the master developer and you were a public agency, those are things you'd be thinking about.
Well, they didn't, and it's not to get after Dave, and I hope he comes on and talks with me about this, but this is just critical thinking.
Yeah.
I remember I criticized him, and I might say I criticized him, not to be mean or anything, but I criticized something he said. I want to make that point. I like Dave a lot, okay? And I don't want anybody to take that. We're all here. That's not the idea. I was really concerned that he said, I want a $12 billion, we're going to have a $12 billion build out, but he didn't announce what the tax increment financing revenue throw off would be, which is roughly $9 billion, just north of that, because I calculated it. assuming a 4% rate of growth in assessed value down there over a 45-year period. Now, that showed me they didn't have a fingertip feel for the project, because otherwise they would have said, yeah, we calculated that, and here's how we're going to spend it. They would have had their own sources and uses, right? But instead, what Dave was trying to do was sound impressive. We're going to spend $12 billion here. That's what he was after. He wasn't thinking in terms of, from the perspective of tax increment financing planner. That wasn't in his head.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and
Wow.
and as you know, all the way the tax increment works is there are assets and liabilities on that balance sheet. There's revenue and there are expenses, and for all I know, he's totaling up both as part of that $12 billion.
No, he doesn't. I'm not saying this to insult Dave. Dave is not that sophisticated with that, and I'm just saying that publicly.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is there's the way you get that number, and we've talked about this before. Obviously, is been not transparent. They haven't talked about it, and they're obviously including the value of the public infrastructure in that number too.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I'm going at is that they got the cost, the build out, right? But when you do a build out and you're doing it on what's supposed to be a tax increment redevelopment project area, it's 55 acres. The first thing in your head should be, and I texted him about this the minute he said it. I said, why are you saying that and not explaining what the revenue throw off would be? Because then you can turn around the next breath and say, my goodness, we're going to give you $9 billion. Look at what you can do with $9 billion, and you have SB 293 Skinner, which allows you to use part of it for citywide, projects deemed of community-wide value.
Right.
That's the wording, which could then have allowed you to get the truck stop you wanted and the turning basin.
Yeah.
And other fixes, right?
All kinds of stuff. And I think that's where we're at. The project itself needs to be reflective of a broader vision of what they're going to be doing. If it doesn't actually include seaport compatibility measures and the community benefits and these grade separations and other things like that, they're going to keep having problems. And the city's putting themselves in the corner where they're promising to find, off-terminal infrastructure, off-site infrastructure that they could have financed. It is just, it's a mess. It asks the question, I think, maybe to bring this back to where we started, it asks the question in a way which is really consistent with why you have really, really rigorous planning and rigorous analysis in an EIR, but also leading up to other decisions like your development agreement and all the subdivisions and parceling it out and making your deal at the port. Public agencies need to be able to know what the basis for these decisions are and where they're putting their resources and why they're cutting deals. And you don't do that in the dark. At least you shouldn't. And I think that's really the basis of a lot of this suit. If you're looking at this again from some of the comments that we've seen in the press from the A's talking about how crazy this is and it's out of left field, that is just silly. I mean, they've seen this coming for years. That's why they went and they got the streamlining statute. The project is not being held up because California is a bad place to do business. I mean, everyone has an opinion about whether or not it's easy to do business in California, i.e. it's not, because it's not an opinion you need to debate when it is. But in the grand scheme of things, he's got a streamlined CEQA statute. He's better off than most. He's got a willing partner in the city of Oakland to make this a reality. That's a better situation than most. He's got his own TIF statute that's better off than most. And he's got, apparently, a city agency is willing to go out and get hundreds of millions of dollars of public money for his project. That's better than most too. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, of all the people to be complaining about how hard it is to do business in California, it shouldn't be the A's. They've been granted every single thing that they've asked for on a silver platter with respect to process. The only thing they haven't done is they haven't worked well with their neighbors, and that's us.
So what do you say if the A's announce in 2 months we're taking off to Las Vegas and they point at Mike Jacob and say, doggone that, Mike chased us out of Oakland?
I don't know. Just have to go to A's games in Vegas together, I guess.
Yeah, there you
go. All I know is the bleachers are going to be more expensive. I just don't think that I don't see that as a reason why you don't talk to people when you've chosen the site you've chosen, whether you're whether you're going to think about Vegas as an alternative or not. You should address the issues that are there, and you should talk to the people that are currently using that site and concerned about it. And we're slated to grow. So this idea that somehow we're not using it now and it's not a marine terminal now and it's never going to be a marine terminal, even if that's all true, our vision for what's happening in Oakland is not what's happening in 2022. It's how are we going to do stuff 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And if you think the fight over us being upset about the Howard Terminal EIR is bad, wait until there's 3,500 new residents living at Howard Terminal and my member has an EIR for a brand new marine terminal upwind with who knows how many new truck moves and how many more trains going through there and more ships in that turning basin and more tugs on those ships and more light and more noise. That's what we're looking at. So if you think this litigation is tame or is a problem, it's going to be tame compared to the kind of stuff that we're going to have to deal with if this project goes through. So, all of this is turnabout is fair play. One of the reasons why we know how effective CEQA is at addressing environmental issues is because we have to follow it when we develop our terminals. Specifically in Oakland, but also in Southern California. We have the most advanced, most expensive, cleanest terminals in North America, and by some respects in the world. The A's can point at us and say, isn't it ironic that polluters use environmental laws to go after us? I don't know. Maybe in their book it is, but in my book, it actually is the opposite. We know exactly what these processes need to be. We've seen them. We've invested in a lot of technology and infrastructure because of them. A's don't do what we have to do when we develop on the waterfront. And that just isn't fair. And we're not going to stand by and let that happen.
Next moves, next steps. Where are we after all the saber rattling is calmed down?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We've talked through the end of the business day, but I think the filing deadline is technically midnight tonight, 11:59. So we'll see how many ultimate how many lawsuits get filed on the website once they update it. Like I said, I mean, we know we have at least 3. It's us and Union Pacific Railroad and the Capitol Corridor. And we're waiting to see if there are other community groups that file or not, because out of those 400 comments, it is entirely possible that one of them does. And if they don't, then that's fine too. Like I said before, once things are on the record, everything is fair game. If you showed up and you were, original participant, you can assert private interests and you can assert public interests once you're there. So anything that was put on the record and is a potential failure, is potentially subject to scrutiny by the court.
Would your group be interested in being the maritime developer and taking advantage of that new redevelopment area and that base level potential near $2 billion of assessed value, particularly since you're talking about, in this case, you were talking about an enormous amount of unsecured property?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd really like to keep talking about a lot of things on that site, including the turning basin and the potential for leveraging any of those tax increment financing opportunities into additional infrastructure, additional equipment. As you pointed out, that language is pretty broad in there, and I think people that are saying that you can't use it for services and operations, I think that's true, but there's plenty of capital opportunities.
Actually, I'll put a ringer on that. Per the now, it's dormant, but it still has been a matter of precedent. Section 33678 subdivision B of the California Health and Safety Code allowed the use of tax increment financing for the provision of services as long as the intent was spelled out in the redevelopment plan. So if you take a look at the current enhanced infrastructure financing district legislation, it actually does allow for the provision of services. It actually spells it out. It's a spell it out that way. But in terms of what you're allowed to do with establishing Head Start programs and what I call a unit, if I say a Head Start program, I see that as a service because it doesn't tell me, hey, I can't help them pay for water, food, or anything else, right?
Right.
You have to read that in a way that is more along the lines of what does it take to do that thing, and what it takes to do that thing is to provide a service. Exactly.
We'll figure that out. We'll figure that out. But I think your question is the right one, and the way that relates back to all this is it part of the project?
Yeah.
Right? And right now it's not. I mean, we're on the outside looking in. We're going to be asking for the port and the city to keep negotiating with us on seaport compatibility measures. Outside of the CEQA process, whether you think they're environmental or not, or whether or not you think the EIR was done well or not, however this turns out, there's a practical question. And the practical question is this going to work? And what's the quality of life for people going to be, and can we grow? Those are real issues. Whether CEQA tells you need to deal with them or not, you're running a city and you're running a seaport. Maybe your developer doesn't care, but public officials need to.
And for those watching who might have the idea that this means the A's are automatically out of here, that's not true. And the reason isn't true is because, I'll just say this right out, they're not going to get as comprehensive a public participation deal in Las Vegas as they will in this context. For a host of reasons, among them, the tax throw-off is not as great. The problem, if someone mentions hotels, is that Las Vegas has already maxed out what it wants to do politically with respect to raising its rates in terms of a stadium tax, because they're hyper paranoid over triggering a place where their average room rate is higher than their competitors, like Chicago. And how do I know that? Just go back to the proceedings of the Southern Nevada Tourism Infrastructure Committee that was established by Brian Sandoval. And there is a reason why they went from a 1%, was originally supposed to be a 1% tax, to 0.7%. They ran the calculations and figured out it was too low, and they eventually settled on 88 100 to 1%. They were really bending over backwards to be the reason, to avoid being the reason why the rates were going up there. So if they're going to go through that and then get the stadium tax applied to hotels, they're not going to then turn around and slap another one on it after having told the convention people, hey, you know what? And this was a big deal at the time. This was Mr. Adelson's issue. Mr. Adelson basically had his jihad against the Convention and Visitors Bureau. He didn't like that the Convention and Visitors Bureau was writing a blank monetary check for itself. He's a person who believed in conservative spending and a right-wing point of view. And I'm not advocating that or denouncing one or the other. That's simply fact, okay? He wanted to cut off the blank check. Well, guess what? That sentiment isn't there. And now there's every reason for the Convention and Visitors Bureau to want to get its blank check back. You think the Convention and Visitors Bureau is going to give that to a baseball organization unless they have some control over what's going on? The answer is no. So that's your Vegas picture, folks, right there. Mike.
Great.
Come back.
Always.
Stick around in the background.
Will do.
Hey, folks, anybody else want another perspective on this and you want to come on the show and represent a group, you're always welcome. It's an issue that I think needs to be appropriately fleshed out rather than become the province of social media comments that don't fit legal or development reality. All right, Mike, thanks a lot. Stick around in the background. Dave Caval, please, man. Catherine, come on and explain your case. Let's talk. Subscribe to Zenny62, bookmark oaklandnewsnow.com, and that ends this broadcast. Thanks. It's a pretty long one, Mike. That was a good one.